I am delighted to be chairing this, even though I'm English. I'm going to apologise for that right now and get it out the way. So I've learned so much preparing and looking at your amazing lectures and reading your book, which is on sale afterwards, Making Empire. Not least that the Irish were victims of imperialism as well as fairly aggressive perpetrators of it. I want to start early on. Will you elaborate on the idea that Ireland was a laboratory of empire?
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming along to this session. So Ireland was England's first colony. It was colonized from the 12th century, but that colonization becomes very intense from the 16th century. And basically, England uses Ireland as a laboratory for empire. The first thing is that you train people in the business of imperialism, let them cut their teeth in an Irish context. The other thing is Ireland allows for the development of policies and ideologies. At the panel this morning, we talked a lot about the origins of racism. Now, racism is a term that is a 19th century term. So in the 17th century, we would call it ethnocentricity or othering, but it's the same thing, basically. That really is born in Ireland, particularly with Edmund Spenser, and it goes on then to permeate the empire, not just in India, but globally. Spenser's ideas about cultural superiority, but also advocating, especially in Ireland, and this is where it's so relevant to the conversation today, a very hard line policy. In other words, if the Irish won't play ball, and that means effectively becoming English and Protestant, then they need to be exterminated. He compares them to locusts, to grasshoppers, and advocates for the use of martial law. Remember, imperialism equals violence. That's something that comes across very strongly in Cauvery's wonderful book, Inheritance. So all of this is really tied and tested in an Irish context, as are other things. For example, mapping as tools of empire, using cartography. If you're going to expropriate, you have to map it first.
You've taken us straight to the place that I wanted to go, which is partition.
We can go straight to partition because, again, in that sense, Ireland...
Blueprint.
Exactly. So what happens in Ireland is, it's all very complicated, but Ireland wants home rule. And it doesn't happen because of the outbreak of the First World War. And there's numerous attempts. And so the compromise is basically partition. In between, we have a civil war where the Irish rebel in 1916, and that rebellion in of itself becomes an exemplar, and Irish nationalists, Republican nationalists influence what's going on here in India. But to go back to partition, what happens there is partition is agreed, it's about divide and rule, and the legislation that partitions Ireland takes the Protestant 6 counties that constitute Northern Ireland today and divides it from the remaining countries that are the Republic of Ireland. So the Republic of Ireland is, if you want, post-colonial. Some would argue that Northern Ireland, it's still very colonial. And what we had with the Troubles, we call them euphemistically the Troubles, was effectively a colonial war in Ireland that lasted for 30 years. But going back to partition, where it's so important is it becomes the model then for India and Pakistan, as it does for Israel and Palestine. But in Ireland, things have been quite well mapped and the censuses are reasonably accurate. And so the boundaries create this Protestant state for a Protestant people. Obviously, in an Indian context, they use the same legislation, exactly the same legislation, but when it comes to the boundaries, it's based on poor maps and inaccurate censuses. So the bloodletting that we see happening here in India, and estimates are being revised up to something like 18 million people. I mean, this is just mind-blowing, the numbers of people who lose their lives. Yes, there's a loss of life in Ireland, of course there is, and you get sectarian violence between Catholics and Protestants. especially along the border and Belfast, Derry, but the bloodletting is nothing like it is here in India. So I think in so many ways, Ireland is that. I could keep going, but I'll stop now,
No,
Bee.
but then to wind us back a little bit, taking us to the first Indian War of Independence, I had no idea how many Irish fighters were in those troops. Talk about that.
So basically, Ireland, if you want, we are the victims of colonisation and imperialism, but also become active perpetrators of it. And I think, this is something that we have to be very clear about and acknowledge. Something like 2/3 of the White Army, the army of the East India Company and of the Raj, 2/3 of that army are comprised of Irish Catholics. These guys are the cannon fodder of the army. They're treated the same as the sepoys. So in other words, if you're an Irish Catholic, you can't be promoted to become an officer. And then we have the officer class. These are usually what we call Anglo-Irish, people who are Protestant. And just a few names: Roberts of Kandahar, the Lawrence brothers. Most people know the Lawrence brothers are particularly well known because there's a school, I think, it's in Shimla, isn't it? But also the Duke of Wellington. He may have found his Irishness an embarrassment, but he was of Ireland. So lots of issues, but probably the most notorious was a man called John Nicholson. I don't know if you guys are familiar with John Nicholson. William Dalrymple describes him as an imperial psychopath, and I think that's too kind. So the War of Independence breaks out, and Nicholson wants to make an example of people he sees as being rebels, insurgents, and he commits, the most barbarous atrocities against the Indian insurgents. Nicholson, however, meets his maker outside the Red Fort, Kashmir Gate. He dies. He's buried in the English graveyard. And I went to visit the graveyard recently. But what I was so struck by was how many other Irish graves there were. They're everywhere. And it's testimony to the fact, and we'll come back to it in a moment, but Cauvery has also written beautifully about these rank and file Irish soldiers who serve and who we in Ireland don't want to talk about because they were associated with the Raj.
We will come to Cauvery because you really are in for a treat. But there's just one further point that I want to get from you, Jane. And I think everyone's now seeing why Jane is the rock star of this festival. Go to all of her sessions if you can. I want you to explore the continuing entwinement of freedom fighters, both on the Indian and the Irish sides, and what that relationship was.
So we could argue that Ireland taught India the ABC of freedom fighting. It's as simple as that. And I'm not saying that other European nations weren't important. And there's 3 types of freedom fighting. One is this call for home rule. In other words, within the context of the Commonwealth. And that's where it all began. Annie Besant. Everybody's heard of Annie Besant. Yay! I was going to say there's an Annie Besant road in every major city in India. Annie Besant, she's Liverpool Irish. She has such an important role to play in terms of the Home Rule League here in India. She's the first president, a woman. It's really quite extraordinary.
There's a De Valera in New Delhi.
Exactly, exactly. So we see very close relationships between these constitutional nationalists, and they work very closely with people in Ireland, especially somebody called Charles Stewart Parnell. But we also see a man called Michael Davitt, who is the leader of the Irish Home Land League. And Gandhi is inspired by his tactics of peaceful resistance. And Gandhi even writes about, of course, Gandhi only wants peaceful resistance, but the use of boycotting, for example, he takes from Michael Davitt. So we've got all of that sort of peaceful resistance to empire. But then we've got also this wonderful link between our cultural nationalists, especially Tagore and Yeats. So Tagore and Yeats were introduced to each other by Margaret Cousins and James Cousins, her husband. You'll have something to say about Margaret in a moment. And then Tagore comes to London. And Yeats, of course, writes the introduction or the preface to Gitanjali. And then that wins the Nobel Prize. Tagore's the first a man from Asia to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Yeats's nose is out of joint because, of course, Yeats has to wait for another few years before he gets his Nobel Prize. But what's so interesting to me is how Tagore then writes a play called The Post Office, which is performed in Ireland in, I think it's 1913, on the eve of the outbreak of the major Irish rebellion, which begins in the post office. And he actually does it as a fundraiser for Patrick Pearse, who is the leader of this 1916 rebellion. And this brings me to the third link between nationalism. And it's really these Republican nationalists, obviously Patrick Pearse himself. But what I find utterly fascinating is 1916 is a disastrous flop. But the British reaction to it is so severe, it actually then triggers effectively independence. And there's a copycat rising in Chittagong, in modern-day Bangladesh, in 1931. And it's exactly copying 1916 and what happens in the GPO. It's fascinating. But also those relationships between Irish and Indian freedom fighters. So we heard about Terence McSweeney this morning, but he really inspired Indian freedom fighters. Das does a copy, he dies in Lahore, I think, of starvation, as does McSweeney. Dan Breen writes a book called The Fight for Irish Freedom. It's translated into Hindi and Bengali and all of the Indian languages. But the people like Michael Collins, who is, if you want, the founder of guerrilla warfare, becomes a pin-up boy in India, as does Eamon de Valera. And Eamon de Valera then becomes very friendly with Nehru. And de Valera comes, visits India in 1948 as on an anti-partition tour, because he says to India, for God's sake, don't repeat this mistake. Of course, falls on deaf ears. But de Valera, it's a lovely story. So the viceroy at the time is Lord Mountbatten. So Lord Mountbatten's last official act as the Viceroy of India was to host a dinner for Eamon de Valera and Nehru. Ironies within ironies within ironies. Here, these two men who had, done most to bring down the British Empire. One final comparator when it comes to nationalism. Now Ireland is an independent country. Obviously, you've got Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, but Nehru is very influenced by the Irish Constitution. And he actually models the Indian Constitution on the Irish Constitution. They're different in one very important way. Nehru is committed to having a secular state. So he was the wise one. Because of the Irish Constitution, we linked church and state, which was a disaster, and we've been regretting it ever since. So I'll stop there, Bee.
That was fascinating. And I really, thank you. Yeah. I urge you to buy the book, which will be on sale afterwards, because it's just fascinating and beautifully written. But I want to bring you now to the woman over whom two nations are fighting for ownership. Indo-Irish Cauvery, who, as a hyphenated writer, and indeed you're chairing a panel about hyphenated narratives later, but you have brought together this history in this most exquisite book, The Inheritance, which is an incredibly touching love story set against a background of violence, and you capture two timelines. Would you please introduce us to that work and the people within it?
Thank you, Bee. And I have to say, I'm kind of pinching myself that I'm here on the stage with Jane, because I've spent nearly 20 years using Jane's research to inform my fiction. And it's one of the reasons I've taken so long, because once you start reading Jane, you kind of get lost in it. And I just wanted to go on and on reading, Anyway, so just to come back to The Inheritance, it's set in 1980. In the Beara Peninsula, which is a absolutely stunning and beautiful remote peninsula in the southwest of Ireland. And it's about a young London Irish fellow who inherits a cottage and comes back to Ireland when most young men are leaving the peninsula. And it's what happens to him and who he meets and how he settles into this very remote rural community. But
so running it's a community where everybody knows everybody. They're all up in each other's business.
Yeah.
One of the parts I really loved is that the bus, the public transport is like the arterial vein that feeds life to this community.
Yeah, and it still does, not just in the 80s, it still does. And through the book, I've threaded a story from 400 years ago, again using a lot of Jane's research, to tell the story of one of the last clan leaders. He was O'Sullivan Beara was his name, and he was one of the last people to hold out against the English. And so I've threaded his story through the book.
So may I, if you don't have a clear map in your minds, I would ask you to imagine, England, Scotland, Wales, and then the island of Ireland. And of course, the English come in and push towards the west. So the west ends up being the final pockets of resistance. And this is where you place that earlier narrative.
Yeah, and it's literally, they're pushed into a forest, which is the forest of Glengariff, which still exists. It's one of the it's the second oldest oak forest in Europe. Yeah. And they were holed up there for a good long while, and definitely for 6 months as a group. And the story is about what happens to the people that are left behind, because O'Sullivan Beara, on the 31st of December 1602, realized that all was lost, and literally within a few hours decided to up sticks and head to the very north of Ireland in County Leitrim, where he was very certain that he would get shelter from the O'Rourkes.
But it's a terrifying narrative. So you have a sort of a defiant population literally hiding in the forest, with nowhere else to go. Famously, the animals are all slaughtered. Can you give us detail around the series of events that leads to them being just forced from their land?
Yeah, so O'Sullivan Beara, when he was hiding in the forest, his cattle, there were 5,000 head there were 3,000 head of cattle and about 2,000 sheep. And the English and the Irish armies were separated literally by 6 kilometers. At its widest, and they were even as close as 2 kilometers in some spots. But that particular forest and that whole peninsula is a tropical rainforest style of forest, and very, very thick. And even though there was very little distance between them, they were not, they weren't visible to each other, and the Irish were very difficult to find. But eventually, the English stumbled upon the herd of cattle that had been kept in a separate townland and in a separate part of the forest, slaughtered them all in the one go. And to this day, that particular collection of fields is called Derrina Fulla, which translated in Irish means the field of blood. Yeah, the oak field of blood, because the whole place just ran with blood. Anyway, when this happened, O'Sullivan Beara decided to just up sticks in a few hours, and that night on New Year's Eve, they set off. So all he left with about 1,500 to 1,800 people, and only 16 or 17 arrived alive 16 days later. And all through, right, as they moved across the length of Ireland, they were killed by other Irish tribes who had been threatened that if you give these people help, you will lose everything. So it's a story that's slightly untold even in Ireland, because it was a matter of great shame, that the O'Sullivans and their kinspeople were killed by other Irish. So it was Irish on Irish. And therefore, there was no poets, no bards wrote about it, because it was a matter of shame. And the people that were left behind were the elderly, the sick, the very young. And my story from the past is told through the eyes of a very young boy. He's only 5 years old, 5 or 6 years old. Yeah.
And you manage this beautifully, the weaving between the two timelines, and very tenderly drawn, and particularly the scenes that are seen through the eyes of a child, a vulnerable child, is beautifully done, because you live there, right? What does it feel like to be in a place that is called the Fields of Blood?
It was actually quite a spooky thing happened, in that I was halfway through, well, not halfway, I was maybe 3 or 4 chapters into the book when I realized that the ridge on which our house stands actually had the English on the left and the Irish on the right. And, when I found that out, when I found out the actual location overlooked both the camps, I just felt I was meant to write the book,
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we can all be so glad that she did. And like I said, you can buy it afterwards. Do join the signing queue that will be, I'm sure, streaking around the building. I'm glad you mentioned Tagore, and I'm glad you mentioned areas of history that the poets and bards never reached, because I think there's an incredibly important role for creative engagement with the vital source materials that your work has so clearly provided. But what does a novelist bring to this that the source material can't give? Like, what does that bring us?
So I was at the, can I say it? I was at another literary festival. I was at the Kerala Literary Festival, and Ireland's Booker Prize winner from last year, Paul Lynch, spoke, and he was very. It's just the way he said it, It's one thing to write about politics, and to write a political story, but everything actually happens in the kitchen. And I just thought that was so perfect, So I think as writers of fiction, you're able to tell the story in a very, very micro way, in a tiny way, in a tiny micro fashion, from somebody's kitchen table, while Jane would be, telling the story from war rooms and,
centuries and a sweeping narrative.
Yeah.
And what does that do to our understanding of things like imperialist history, to be able to go into that close-up personal detail?
I think it shows how ordinary people really suffered, especially children, especially disabled, whether you were physically or intellectually disabled. Women really, really suffered. They were always the ones left behind.
It's almost as though when we witness almost unspeakable violence, that this is the only way to talk about it. And there was a previous session about Gaza where Selma Dabag described young Gazan and Palestinian writers who are responding to events with really witty and creative ways. And I find that really inspiring, really, really quite extraordinary. Is there anything you'd like to?
I'd love to get in here too, Bee, because what I love about creative writers is they bring imagination. I'm a historian. I have to check every single fact. I'm dry. I'm boring. I can't get, no, really. I mean, because it has, I have to be able to say, well, there's evidence. Everything should be empirically grounded as a historian. Whereas the liberty that you have to hear the voices of the marginal, children, the less able, that's what I love. I think writers are like canaries in the mine. They're the ones who, speak truth to power. They're the ones who are able to allow us to deal with trauma. I grew up in Belfast during the Troubles, and I found that Seamus Heaney's work, he was able to articulate which something the rest of us couldn't do. And I think that's what Cauvery does. And I love the fact so much of her work is historical because she gives voice. And when I read, I loved Inheritance, the way that she brings alive the 16th century. Can I say something about The Tainted as well?
Please do.
So I'm just going to, please read this book as well as Inheritance. I think it's available in the bookshop. It's called The Tainted. And it's a story, it sets, again, split story, 1980s, but also it goes back to the turn of the 20th century. And it looks at a relationship between an Irish private, one of those squaddies I was talking about earlier, who has a relationship with an Anglo-Indian woman, except she's not Anglo, she's Irish Indian woman. And they have a child. The child is born out of wedlock, but they love each other. Anyway, he's involved in a mutiny and he's killed. But here she is left holding the baby. And it's the story of Rose. And I wept at the end of it. I mean, it's so powerful. And I think, again, these people are absent from the archives, yet Cauvery can bring them alive and give them a voice. And that's the beauty of literature and of creative writers.
It is. It takes you inside those lives. Absolutely.
Thank you,
I
Jane.
have to say, and you write with such tenderness, and it's also very funny. So I hope you're getting the sense that we love her books. I'm going to take it to an awkward place for me, and it's why English people don't know anything about 1916. Why it seems that even Boris Johnson wasn't aware that we have a border with Ireland. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable that I know a lot more about France and French history. I know their revolutions. I know the American revolutions. I don't know about 1916. What is going on?
Can I say it again? The English love to forget and the Irish love to remember. I mean, it's so true. I think there is this ethnocentricity. The Irish were looked down on, and that continued right into the 20th century. And during the Troubles, this conflict I was talking about, that really went for 30 years, 1968 to 1998, an Irish person, there was a lot of racism. Even though we're the same color, I mean, there was prejudice against the Irish. No Irish need apply. It's not just in the UK. We also saw this in the United States in an earlier time. So I think, there is this sense of the English are superior to the Irish. What ended that was the visit of Queen Elizabeth II to Dublin in 2000, I think it was 2011, wasn't it? And she said, I was doing commentary for the BBC, and she was giving a speech. She only gave one speech, and it was in Dublin Castle, the seat of English imperialism in Ireland. And she got up and she said, let's bow to the past. Let's not be bound by it. And it was very liberating because she'd always wanted to visit Ireland. It was the one country she wasn't allowed to visit because the IRA would have tried to kill her. So she had finally got there, and she went to our Garden of Remembrance where we were remembering our own freedom fighters, and she bowed. It wasn't a perfunctory it was a bow. And then she got up and she acknowledged the pain of the past. She referred to Mountbatten. I mentioned him a moment. He was assassinated by the IRA in 1979. And she said, we've all lost loved ones. And it was a very interesting moment because in Ireland, we've been blessed with amazing presidents. And our two previous presidents, Mary Robinson, Mary McAleese, had really worked very hard on this Anglo-Irish relationship. And which I think is now in a different place. So I think that has fed into it. Although I'd like to think now we have a Labour government, we're actually able to move forward in a very respectful way. It's all about dialogue based on evidence. And just on Boris Johnson, for your information, Boris Johnson's daughter was at Trinity. She studied in Trinity the whole way during Brexit. Why? Because he wanted to go to a European university. So, I mean, the hypocrisy of Johnson just beggars belief.
Cauvery, is there anything that you'd like to add to this idea of selective history?
I think a lot of the fiction that came out of from English writers was very jingoistic. They kind of wasn't it, Jane? I mean, they went with the establishment
and the stereotypes.
Yes, yeah. So it was always that when they wrote about the East, they always were the benefactors and the ones who were going to put it right, and they got rid of sati, and of course they gave us the courts and the railways. We can't forget that.
The railways, yeah. Okay, I don't ever want to talk about railways. Can we go to questions now, please, to save us from the railway conversation? Get ready, pop your hands up. I know you'll be brimming with questions for our two brilliant speakers. We've got people poised with microphones, so don't be shy. I can see. What's happening? Why are you all so shy? Oh, thank you. There's one here. Nobody else got a question? There's some here. Okay. Keep your hands up if you have a question. I would generally ask for a question from a woman. And I've found one. Sorry, guys. Over here, please. I will come to you, though. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful session. I have a question from Jane. You made a comment, you compared your work with Cauvery's work, how literature people, narrators have a creative liberty to use imagination, whereas your work has empirical limitations. But don't you think that history is also imaginative? For example, the Silk Route, books like Silk Route, which kind of reimagines history, right? So how do you place your argument within imagination and everything? Thank you.
Thank you. And listen, I don't want to be too hard on the historians. We're storytellers as well, and we should be storytellers as well. But, you know, the evidence has to be there. And that means actually looking for it. And because very often I'm leading a big project at the moment, recovering the voices of non-elite women in the 16th and 17th century. And for decades, we've been told you can't do that. Their voices aren't there. But you know what? They've been hiding in plain sight. So, you know, I think historians could and should, but it doesn't always happen that way. So in other words, yeah, go back to the archives. But for me, sadly, to be able to construct the sort of dialogue and use this sort of vivid, tender imagination that Cauvery has, I just can't do that. But I should be a good storyteller.
And I can attest that Jane is obviously, as you can tell, a brilliant storyteller. There was, yes, to return to our friends here, the person that I originally offered a question to, it was you, wasn't it? Please come
Ma'am, you said a while ago that Irish people taught Indian the ABCs of independence. I have never heard a historian use such a blanket statement. So can you please elaborate on that? Because what we have read is that Gandhi's idea of peaceful protest come from Jainism and Buddhism.
This is going back to Michael Davitt and Gandhi. This is in the archives and in Gandhi's own words. I'm just repeating he definitely acknowledges that Michael Davitt. Michael Davitt is based in London at this point. He's an MP. And Naroji, who of course comes from Bombay and goes on to write a very important book. What's it called? British Rule and Poverty. I can't remember the title anyway. All go back to Michael Davitt and the Land League. So I think that's very clearly documented. Doesn't mean other things don't influence Gandhi. Of course they do. But the Land League is extremely important. I didn't catch the beginning of the question, but I hope that answers it.
Thank you. Here. A microphone here for...
Hi, that was a beautiful session. Thank you, everyone. And Cauvery, my question is for you. When writing historical fiction, what is it that a person has to be very careful about? About the sensitivities of the people who are going to read it?
Yeah, I think as a writer, you always have this fear that, you know, the fictitious voice is going to be mistaken for your voice. So when I was writing about Anglo-Indians in The Tainted, for example, or in The Inheritance, when I was talking about unwed mothers, you know, you're always fearful that your reader is going to think, oh my God, that woman, she thinks like that, you know. But actually, it's your characters who think like that. So that is that's a bit of a danger. You know, you could get abuse online for that. I mean, you know, a serious reviewer wouldn't, but.
But in addition to that question, may I add, because it's a courageous, it's a contested area, the use of dialect and accent, which obviously as an English I can't comment on, but you use a lot of accented and dialect language.
Yeah, and you know, I debated a lot about that, but it just didn't sound natural to write The Inheritance in anything except a West Cork way. It wouldn't, I actually couldn't have written it.
Did you have trepidations about that? What was the thinking behind it?
You know, the trepidation was not about writing with a West Cork accent or in the West Cork idiom. The trepidation was writing a wholly Irish book. Yeah, so that was the huge trepidation, was writing a wholly Irish book. And I distinctly remember being in a car with my son and telling him, oh, I don't know, you know, I'm having doubts. I don't think maybe I should revert to writing about India. And he just said, oh, feck it, Mum, you're just procrastinating. Just write the damn book. You know,
always listen to the young people.
Yeah, and sometimes you need to listen to your own children. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Keep your hand up if you've got a question and we'll come to you. Is there anyone at the back that we've neglected? There's an eager person there. Waving man, right at the back. Somebody find him, please. Okay, you're first and then waving guy.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to see you both. I'll declare that I'm an Irish Gujarati, which is an unusual mix. And I have partition history on both sides of the family. I've just been to visit my father and grandfather's home in Jamnagar in Gujarat. And I went to Belfast last year to visit my Irish grandfather's home when he was kicked out and went to Dublin. And 5 years ago, I was here listening to...
There's got to be a question.
Yeah, an oral historian, Anchal Malhotra, who's written a book about partition, remnants of separation. And I wonder if this thing about our history, is it a question of time? Because none of our parents or grandparents wanted to talk about their experience, whether it was in India or whether it was in Ireland. And interested in both your reflection from a kind of non-fiction and fiction perspective of whether this is a time issue, and the time is now to be talking about these issues.
I'm happy to say a few words about that. So oral history is so important. We have some majorly very important projects ongoing in Ireland about the Troubles, led by Anna Bryant at Queen's. But also, very controversially, there were tapes made in Boston College that have fed into a number of recent books. The best is by Patrick Redden Keefe. It's called Say Nothing. However, that has become very contested and messy because of the way that it was done. So if you're going to do oral history, you have to be very clear about how it's done and what the legality around the tapes are. And I think, so that's one issue. Another issue, I know there are major projects going on in India, about India, but they're in Harvard, they're in the UK, and I think it's only relatively recently that India has really looked to try and create these oral history archives. I had the privilege of visiting the Partition Museum in Delhi a few days ago. It was last week. I cannot tell you how impressed I was, but how Kishwar Desi has gone through and collected so many recordings of people who are now dead. She's been doing it for 10 years. And with such great sensitivity has actually presented this material. It's in Ambedkar University in Old Delhi. I cannot tell you how good it is, really. But I would also say that in India, it's still very difficult. And people don't want to talk about it because it's traumatic.
Yes. But shout out for the archivists, the unsung heroes. We have a question, Mr. Waving guy at the back, and then a question here, and that's our last two. So keep them snappy.
Thank you, Jane and Cauvery. So this is more of a personal question to both of you. So I was just wondering that as a historian and as a writer, when you come across such amazing facts, both in a negative way and a positive way, how does, as a writer, if it affects you personally, and then how do you, get it into on the paper, as in without your ideology not hindering that? That's one. And two, even as a historian, sometimes, it's very disheartening to see history, because our history is full of blood all across the country, all across the world.
Cauvery, do you want to?
Yeah, I have to say now, I'm 63 years old, and I have 5 book projects to do. And every time I come across yet another amazing hidden history or hidden story, I'm just thinking, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time to tell these stories. There are literally so many stories, like even the gentleman who spoke just before us, the Irish Gujarati person, that's a story in itself. So there are so many hidden histories and so little time to write them.
Yes.
Can I give a very quick answer to that? I think a lot is about training. As a historian, you have to be trained in a way that you must try and be fair, and your own prejudices and your own opinions you keep to one side, because but that's also the 17th century. I work on probably the most grisly and violent period in Irish history, where we see ethnic cleansing and genocide in the mid-17th century. I find that deeply disturbing as I look at conflicts in the modern era, because that was us, albeit centuries ago, and I think it does impact on you, but then that's where the training kicks in.
Last question.
Fascinating to hear about the Irish influence upon the Indian independence movement. As you told us, there was this there must have been a whole lot of interaction between Ireland and India, particularly since 2/3 of the sepoys were Irish. So, did you see evidence during the course of your research of Indian influence upon Ireland, upon the Irish?
No, I think I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, there is. There is, of course, there is. And say, for example, with counterterrorism in the modern period. So, a man called Charles Teggart is the police chief in Bengal. He learns the business of counterterrorism in Ireland, but he comes to India to perfect it and then re-exports it back to Ireland, but also then to the Middle East, to Palestine. So you constantly see the imperialists learning their business and then, you know, if you want, going back home and fine-tuning it again. In terms of, there's been many Indians have visited Ireland actually from the 17th century, and it's very interesting to read their accounts of Ireland and how poor they feel Ireland is compared to India. And of course, right through to the ambassador mentioned it a moment ago, I think there's 65,000 people living in Ireland of Indian origin. So they're constant sharing.
I would like you to give a huge round of applause and come and buy the books.